Hey, I'm Frank, and in this video I'm going to show you how I use scanned assets with metahumans. So it's a bit of a process that goes into starting with a scanned asset, wrapping it to a custom model, and then putting it onto a metahuman. But the way that we're going to do it is we're going to keep the existing metahumans the way that they are, so that we can continue to animate it and use the metahuman assets like the hair and the eyes as well at the end of it. So let's get into it. So in this video, we're going to go through starting with a 3D scan store asset, a scanned asset, and then we're going to wrap that to our own custom model that we're then going to create a texture that we can then apply to a metahuman that we've generated from our original mesh. It sounds complicated, but I promise it's not. Let's check it out. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to project the 3D scan store scans onto our mesh. I think that's probably even the way I said it is a little bit difficult to understand. We're not actually projecting the textures. We're going to be deforming the 3D scan store mesh to match ours so that we can throw our one in the bin. And then this is our new base mesh because it's already fit with the UVs and the vertice points from the scan data. So the UVs will just be able to throw textures on and it will match ours perfectly. So you'll see that in a sec. The way you need to do that is you need to wrap this model to look like this, and then we can get rid of this one and use that. So the way that you set that up is your custom model needs to be on the bottom and the scan data needs to be on the top, just so that you know the wrapping tool knows which one to project to, and they need to be on the same world space. So just make sure they're in the same world space here. It doesn't need to be the same scale. Obviously the scan data and the model can be different. But just as long as they're generally in the same spot, so that when you run Zwrap, the screen syncing works well, which you'll see in a sec. So if you don't have Zwrap, you can just go to Zwrap online and download the trial for it. It's just a quick install plugin. I do recommend you buying it though. It's a great tool for any type of projecting from scans. So we're going to click this. Okay, so now what we've got here is we've got our scanned head. So just get this going here. And this is that benefit that we were talking about before of putting them in the same world space, so that when we move them around, they're going to be moving together. And if it's not, you can just click sync up there. So what we want to do here is we want to place points on each model to the landmarks that correspond to each other. So that sounds like a whole bunch of nothing, so let's just do it, and point there is 0, so that point is 0. I usually like to go through and do a bunch and then just correspond it over here. So as long as the numbers that what you're doing are lining up on each model, you can put on as many as you want in a row. All that matters is that these numbers, so we go 4, 5, 6, it needs to be 4, 5, and 6. So I'm just going to go through and do that all through this model. Go through and do the landmarks areas, so the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, and then some of just the registration points like the chin, maybe the sides of the jaw, and then maybe up here. So I'm just going to go through and do that and speed through this, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so when you're done with setting all the points, what you can do is you go down to wrapping, and it will recognize those two meshes and all the points that you've done. You can just hit start wrapping. And then what that's going to do is that's going to now deform the 3D scan store mesh to match your model. So then we can throw that one in the bin, and then our new base mesh is the 3D scan store. So perfect, you can already see that's worked pretty well. Go to done. Okay, so what we've got here is we can get rid of our model and go to the scan data. Now you've got your model with the 3D scan store assets on it, and that looks pretty good. So because I've only done it with the low poly in this one, you can do it with the high res. The Zwrap plugin might run a little bit slower, but if you want to have all the juicy details that come with the 3D scan store model, you can do it with the high res, but just for this demonstration, I've just used the low. So if you did want to divide it back up, you could do that as well. But if you had the original mesh, all those subdivisions will still be there, as well as the textures. So the point of doing this is, now that we have our model with the textures, we're going to bring that over into Unreal. So the Metahuman ID solver can use this texture information as well as the mesh to create our new Metahuman. So let's just export this. What you want to do is just delete high for now, export OBJ and OBJ or FBX, and then jump over into Unreal. So I've just jumped over into Unreal Engine 5 and I've just started a new scene. All I've done here is threw a couple of rec lights in here for our scene and an HDI backdrop. It's not necessary. I've just kind of thrown it in. If you don't have that available and you want to know how to do it, you can just go over to Edit, Plugins, and just type in HDRI, and then HDRI backdrop will be there. You can just click that. It's pretty good. You can drop it in and it kind of maps to the world for you. So that's also not a bad little tip. But what we want to do now is we want to import our model and our new 3D scan store textures. So you can just create a folder in your content. In here, this is just for the video I'm doing. It's just scan to Metahuman. We want to import into here. So our custom model, which is the one that I exported. I usually find that ZBrush and this 3D scan store size is a little bit different. If you have trouble importing where it says that there's redundant polygons, or the degenerate meshes, I think is the error that comes up if you just go straight in. It's because this import uniform scale is probably set to 1. So I usually set this to 100, and that would come in to the world size that I would think would be pretty accurate in here. So if you click import all, there's your model, boom, set them in here, and then we can also, where did that go there? We'll just move him up into here. To where the lights are, you can see there, perfect. And the size is pretty good. So what we want to do now is throw our textures onto this model, which are going to fit perfectly because we've already wrapped it with 3D Scan Store. So I'm going to import those textures. Face diffuse. These are all the textures that come with the models. And we can obviously use normal and displacement and all that in the future, but for this, we're just going to be using the color information, as that's what the ID solver works best with. And as you can see, that just drops in, perfect, and creates its own material. So this obviously isn't the best way to be doing this, as creating material instances and is the best way to be doing it from a master material. But for now, we're just going to set this 1 and left click also makes a parameter here, and we'll just set the roughness down. We'll just make it 0.5. 0.64. Save, so she's not as shiny. Cool. You can see that change there. Beauty. So this is going to be fine for right now. So now what we want to do is we want to create, it's a little bit fast. We want to create a Metahuman ID for this. So the way that we do that is you right click and then go down to Metahuman and then Metahuman Identity. Scan ID, let's just call it that. So this would obviously be your character name or whatever it is, because this is going to be the information that is going to be stored for your character model. And then we get this open, and then this is where we go into how to create the identity for your Metahuman. So before we add our Metahuman into here, we can just jump out of that. So we've got him there. what we want to be doing is setting our textures to our static mesh before we then put it into there. So we can open our static mesh here, and then what we want to change the material to is that material that was generated for us. Save, cool. So now our static mesh has the texture associated with it without us having to do it just in scene here. So if we go into our scan ID now, what we want to be doing is setting in our new mesh. So our mesh is called Custom Model 2. So let's look for that. Custom Model 2, beautiful. And in there, it now has our texture information as well. So what we want to be doing here is setting our camera to set the markers just like we did with the scan of the other in ZBrush. So we want to set this focal length the same way that we would do it if we were doing a portrait, because right now it gets, you know, if we were to crank this up, it'll look a bit like a frog if we were to come in, you know how these viewports look. So we want to crank that down to get the most accurate representation of what our character looks like. So I usually like to do, you know, sub 20, gives you a pretty good cool. So what we want to do is, the way that it works is you need to promote a frame that you set here to then put your tracking markers on. So let's say there, that looks pretty good. We want to promote this frame. So what that's going to do now is we have an active frame that we have our face set on in a neutral pose. We want to then track our active frame. It's going to load the trackers. It's going to recognize where the face is. So what this process is doing is it's going to recognize our mesh and say, hey, we want to make a metahuman from this mesh. So when that's done, you can then jump into here and move the trackers around to fit it a bit better. It obviously does the best it can. But this is just a 2D plane. So this is the frame that we took, the frame that we promoted, and we're just going to move these tracking points a bit more to where they fit. And then we're going to generate our metahuman off this, which is pretty crazy that it can do it just based off these markers. You also want to make sure that the mouth is closed as well. I found that that is very helpful when doing facial animation as well. So we'll just do a couple little tweaks on this just to get the ball rolling and get a mesh generated. So we're just going to go ahead and hit Metahuman Identity Solve, and now it's going to create our mesh for us. So what we need to do to make this submittable is we need to set a body template that matches your mesh. So what we're going to do is we'll just do this one for now. And then click Mesh to Metahuman. So what this is going to do is now take our face, create a new mesh, and with this, you know, temporary body that we can use, and then we're going to have a metahuman based on this. So now what this has done is it has created a mesh, a metahuman mesh based off our template there, which is great. So now we can use all the animations, all the preset hair, eyes, everything that's going to fit perfectly onto this. So before we can do that, what we need to do is, because this is going to be available in Bridge now, which you would sign in if you haven't, you wouldn't be able to get this far if you haven't already created an account. It's free to make one, so just make a Quixel Bridge account. And in UE5, Bridge is inside the user interface. So if it's not here, you can just go up to Window, go down to Quixel Bridge, and then it will open up. I usually just dock it over here. So what it does is it creates a metahuman identity for you. So these are some of the past ones that I've already done with this character, but this is our ID, which has no information in it yet. So what it does, the way that Unreal works with the metahumans is that it has there's an online server-y interface that you go to create your metahuman, to give it a little bit of character and all that kind of stuff. So we're just going to jump over and have a look at that now by clicking this button. So we want to launch this. All right, so now we are in the Metahuman creator, and this is the mesh that it's generated from the identity solve that we've done. So let's start with this guy, edit selected. Cool. So what we want to be doing go through, art direct this whole thing the way that you want. It's not going to really matter as far as the skin and all that kind of stuff, but as like the eyes, that's going to matter because we're actually going to be using these eyes. We're going to be, all these assets that we're using, whether it's the eyes, head, okay, let's, I think it was, this is the one that I'm doing with the character that I'm working on. So let's just, you know, change this a bit. Let's make it, okay. So you can make it whatever you want it to look like. That's cool. So when you're done editing in the Metahuman creator, the live link to bridge that will be in your Unreal, it will automatically update your metahumans for you in here. So what we can do is then download them and then add them to the scene. So this was one that I edited before, which is the character that I'm currently working with. Just say yes. Okay, so when that has downloaded and imported into the scene, you will have your blueprint class. This folder will be generated depending on whatever you've named it. Then you have your metahuman ready to be brought into Unreal. So what we want to do is now make these textures fit onto this face. See, I think that the metahumans are great and they have a lot of cool assets with them. The only issue is that they do lack that fidelity of, you know, real skin textures, even custom textures. Even if you wanted to have paint or face paint or any of this other stuff, it does have this kind of waxy look, but we want to keep the great hair and eyebrows and eyelashes and all these things. So now that we have our metahuman mesh and our identity and all of our information, so if we wanted to drop a animation rig or anything onto this, blink animations, that would all work. But the issue is that it has its own UVs and its own mesh that doesn't correspond to this. So what we need to do is we need to project the similar way that we did at the start of the video. We need to project our information onto this mesh. So the way you go about doing that is using this mesh so that we can stay inside this ecosystem. So we never need to rip anything out. We never need to start retargeting. We can actually just export this mesh, assign the textures to the UVs, and then all we need to do is just drag that new texture in and apply it. So the way that we go about doing that is that in our new Metahuman identity folder, which is when you download and then add to scene, it will create a folder into here. So you've got all of the parts of the metahuman plus your identity, which is this character. So if you were just to drag this into the scene, that's it. But for this, we're going to be working on the face. So let's have a look at the mesh that we want. And it is this mesh here, and assign, we're going to project our scan data onto that. So we're going to go into asset actions, and then over and export. So export this as FBX to a location that you want. And then what we're going to do is we're going to open that up in Maya. So after an eternity of waiting, exporting the face mesh from Unreal, which was just export there, and importing into Maya, this is what you get. So this is all of the levels of detail that come with the Metahuman plus all the rigs. So the beauty of how complicated this all looks is we don't need any of it. All we need is the one mesh. So get rid of the skeleton. Cool. So what I want to do is delete all by type history and delete all by type default history. Cool. So what I want to do also in here, because we've just got our one mesh now, I want to take this and separate. So the reason I separate that is because it's got a whole bunch of other stuff we don't need. So inside here we've got the eyes, the eyelashes, all that kind of stuff. That's already in Unreal. So all we're going to be doing is continuing to use this, but we just need to use the information from this mesh. So you can delete this, and also just in case you didn't know how cool these things are, it's got all that mouth detail in there with the teeth and stuff as well, which is great for when we're going to be using it inside. But now what we're looking at is, so we can get rid of this too. It's just going to lose our, sure, we'll just line that for now. Now we have a Metahuman friendly mesh that looks exactly like ours. Now the last piece of the puzzle is that it doesn't have our textures on it, because it has its own UVs, which is great because this is the universal Metahuman UVs. But we now have our mesh with the Metahuman UVs, which is perfect. So what we're going to do now is export this and import it into ZBrush, and we're going to create a texture from our scanned textures. So we're just going to go ahead and file, export selection. I export it as an OBJ Metahuman base mesh. Export that, and then we're going to jump over into ZBrush and import it back into our scene. So we're back into ZBrush in our original scene. So what we need to do now is import our Metahuman friendly mesh so we can project our textures onto it. So let's just go into the mesh that we were on before, our custom one that we don't need anymore, and bring that in. So we've got our scan data, our friendly scan data that is fit to the mesh we had before. I've just brought in the Metahuman. Now, this is going to happen. So when I hit F to focus up on the full scene, oh, sorry, on the thing that I've selected, it sees the Metahuman mesh. That's great. But the problem is that's our guy down there before. So what we can do is have our Metahuman base mesh selected, go down to deformation and just hit unify. And what that's going to do is do its best job at trying to fit it to the scene scale, which is great. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. We want to redo the process that we did before. So this is a pretty good view of what we can look at, where what Metahuman has done in an attempt to create our mesh. So when we did that identity solve over in Unreal, we said, hey, this is our face, try to make a mesh off it. And this is the result. It's pretty good, it's not bad, it's pretty close. So it's not perfect, and we want to make it perfect, because the way that we're going to do this is we're going to need this to be pixel perfect to this, and we're going to project this texture onto this, and then we're just going to grab that and throw it back into our Unreal Metahuman mesh. So it does seem a little bit back and forthy, but for the moment this is the best way that I've found to project scan textures onto on an Unreal mesh. So what we want to do is we want to wrap this guy to this. So let's go ahead and set that back in world space like we did with the last one, and we're going to do another Zwrap on this one. So the difference between the first time and now is that our scan data is now our base mesh, which is the face that we want to look like. So we're going to need to pull that to the bottom, and we're going to say, hey, adjust this Metahuman base mesh to look like our scan data. So we're just going to swap that order around a little bit, and then we're going to go to Z plugin in the same way, start Zwrap. So we're back into here. So now what we want to do is we say, hey, Metahuman, we want to look like this. So we're going to go ahead and place all the points again, like we did last time. I'm going to speed through that, and then we're going to adjust our metahuman, just tweak it slightly to look a little bit more like what we want. So then when we project our information, it's going to be pixel perfect onto our metahuman mesh. Okay, so now we've placed all the points for our mesh, and we're going to do a similar wrap that we did before. So that now our metahuman is going to be matching perfectly to our scan data head, and then we're going to create a new texture for our metahuman mesh. Perfect. So our metahuman base mesh, let's get rid of our scan data one. Don't worry about up there, that's fine. All we're using this for is for a texture projection. So this whole process is purely to make a texture. So we can divide him up. Cool. So what we want to do is go back to our scan data head. We're going to hide the metahuman for now. What we want to do is take this texture information and project it via polypaint, and then we're going to project that onto our pixel perfect mesh over here. The texture information is only as good as the density of this. So if we were to project, so say the texture's off, cool. So if we said to polypaint and say, hey, we want to grab that texture information and throw it onto our vertex information here. There's only so much vertex information in there. So if we were to hit texture from polypaint, it's going to do its best job at trying to project that texture onto here. So if we up the resolution of our texture map and then polypaint, try that again with a lot more information, polypaint from texture, now we have a texture that's fitting. It's not using any texture at all. It's purely polypaint, and it's basically the same thing. So now we have a mesh with vertex color from scan data that fits exactly to our mesh, and we have a metahuman mesh that fits exactly to that. So what we want to do now is we want to project our scan data onto the metahuman. So all we need to do is project all. Hey, this has polypaint information. Would you like to project the polypaint? Which is exactly the process that we want to be doing always, yes. Perfect. So let's get rid of our scan data. And now we have a metahuman mesh with scan data on it, polypainted projected. Now that we have our scan data, we can turn that off. All that matters is our metahuman mesh. So our metahuman mesh we've imported here, we've projected our polypaint scan data onto it, which is great. You can see that there's a couple of little parts here, which honestly doesn't matter because we're not even using this mesh. But that's because I've just done a project with one hit. It's actually pretty good from not going through the stages like you usually would. But what we want to do now is we just want to export this as a texture. So if you go down to texture map, you're going to see that we've got nothing in there, but we want to go new from polypaint. So now we have a metahuman texture, a texture map from the scan data that matches the exact metahuman UV. So all we need to do is clone this texture, and it will go to here. And then we need to export that. And now we can just drop that on inside of Unreal, and it will map perfectly to our metahuman. So what we want to do now is import our textures that we've just exported from ZBrush, our polypaint projected textures, import from wherever you imported them to. Now I've got them in here. So what we want to do now is go into the material of the Metahuman and swap out the texture, the diffuse texture for the skin. So we're going to go through, like we can go through and do the same process for the specular and the normal and all that for the maps. We're just going to do it with the diffuse here so you can see how it works. So if we go into the face of our Metahuman, all we're doing here is clicking your blueprint identity, going down to the face, and then just like any other object in Unreal, you've got all your different material attributes here like you would on a multi-sub. So we're going to click on the face, go into the material that's associated with it, and then this is our Metahuman skin. So what we want to do is we want to reassociate the textures with those new ones that we just did, our base color. So we're just going to go ahead and so it's Metahuman texture, find that in here. There it is. And just like that, you can see how much better. So we're going to copy this for all the different levels of detail because it's going to be changing as we move away from the camera. So we can hit save. And just like that, you have scanned data textures inside your Metahuman mesh. So now that we've proved the pipeline for working with Metahumans and changing the scan textures, we're just going to do a quick little demo on how that can be beneficial in using the rigs and using the way that it is set up so that we haven't actually changed any of the structure of how it's built. So we're just going to delete this for a second. And we're going to go into create level sequence. Let's just call it scan test sequence. Cool, so we've got an empty scene, and what we want to do is just drop our Metahuman into the sequencer. Cool. So now, because we've continued to use our existing setup and the model is exactly the same as when it was generated from Metahuman, all we've done is change our textures. So we can still use, if you turn off snapping up here, if you've got snapping on, now our Metahuman works perfectly with our scanned textures. So we'll showcase one last thing. This is obviously applicable to just any Metahuman, but it's cool to test it when you've got new textures in it, especially if you've got new clothes or anything like that, is to be able to continue to use the Unreal ecosystem and the rigs that they have. So the beauty of doing this means that we can download animation packets and new assets from the marketplace and just drop them straight in, and they will work perfectly with your Metahuman because we haven't messed with any of the structure of the rig, and we haven't broken any of the connections. We've just purely changed cosmetic information. So I'm going to be using a U asset that has been supplied to me by Gabriella, who goes by Feeding Wolves. I just wanted to say a huge shout out to her. I'll put her link to her channel in the description. I'm sure you've all heard of her. It's just made the testing process for me very easy, and it's really cool to see how U assets come in after using motion capture. So thanks again for that. So the way that you would do that is you go into the area that you want to animate, whether it's the face or the body. In our case, it's the face. So we're going to go to track, and then animation. I've loaded in a U asset of an animation sequence of a face animation, and it's purely just more of a test of the animation working. And as you can see, the scan textures are working pretty well. So that's the end of this video. Thanks a lot for watching, and I really hope that you got something out of this. If you have any questions, please hit me up in the comment section or on ArtStation. Yeah, again, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.